questions? All right, let's welcome Shane.
All right, so good morning. I enjoyed Kent's presentation very much, actually. I just wanted to show you a couple of things that relate to that. On the Humble Skeptic website, there is an articles and essay section. So if you go to the top, there's the articles. And in this articles section, there's an article here on did palm trees grow in Jerusalem? And one of the things I show in that article is this little image from my own private collection. You can see the Humble Skeptic logo over there. So, but this is a coin from 11 AD that prominently displays the palm tree like he was showing. But the cool thing is that a lot of scholars sometimes will argue that they didn't actually have palm trees in Jerusalem. So when they talk about the waving of the palm branches on Palm Sunday, there's actually only one gospel that discusses this, and it's John's gospel. So some people they say that's a mark of inauthenticity because they didn't actually have palm trees in Jerusalem. But when you go and you look at the coinage, or you actually look at the Talmud, they actually say that for special occasions, they would actually sell palm branches, wrap them with gold thread, and then you could buy them for these festive occasions. Palm branches, it mentions them. So it's just the claim by certain skeptics along those lines just doesn't hold water. A lot of people believe things that sound plausible according to your worldview. If you are the kind of person who says, oh yeah, that's all mythology, you hear something like that, they didn't even have palm branches. Yeah, well that just shows it's authentic. So you have to check, especially when there's a conflict. You know, has anyone ever doubted that Antarctica exists?
Mm-hmm.
You have?
No, me personally not.
Oh, okay. Okay.
But
Some people have.
Yeah.
Yeah, because it could just be that they showed you pictures of Iceland and they called those pictures Antarctica, right? It's a conspiracy. Well, nobody really thinks that. There's been so many people who've been there, and so many cartographers. You just trust it because there isn't a conflict about it. When it gets to worldview issues, there's more conflict, and everybody is wearing one of the hats for one of the teams. You can't sort of step out, but all the worldviews can't be right. So you should check when there's a conflict. Like, what's the real thing going on? And this is a good example that there's very good evidence that there really were palm branches, and that Palm Sunday is a thing. All right. He also mentioned an ossuary that had the name Yehohana, daughter of Yehohanan. That's Joanna, the daughter of John, son of Theophilus the high priest. I'm of the conviction that Theophilus is the one to whom Luke addresses his gospel. Often in the commentaries, even from conservative New Testament scholars, that's not even an option. Theophilus is either some unknown ruler of the Gentiles, or it means friend of God. They take the meaning of the name. And it says, friend of God, it's a generic thing. It's like a flowery preface. But Luke does say most excellent, and the most excellent is a title that we gave to the priests. And this particular priest reigned from about 38 to 41, which is very early. He would have had that title up until his death, whenever that was. But fascinating thing is, if you look at the Gospel of Luke, there's a mention of a Joanna. He's the only one that mentions a Joanna. She's a very obscure character, although she does make it in episode 3 of The Chosen. She's now less obscure. Somebody referenced her like a decade ago, and I'm like, I don't even know this person, because she's just a very minor character. She was one of the women who funded Jesus' ministry out of her means. And it turns out in Luke chapter 8, she's married to Chuza, the household manager of Herod. Well, that's at least what it says in the English translation, like your ESV. Household manager, though, is a bad translation. So I did a lot of work on this. In the Greek, it says epitropos, okay, which is basically the governor. It's like Pilate's role, except for of a different region. Herod was of the Galilee region. So he would be like in fact, Philo, when he mentions Joseph, calls Joseph the epitropos of Pharaoh. When Joseph, back in Genesis, he became the right-hand man. He became the effective ruler, the prime minister. Prime minister is probably a very good definition. Cuzo's the epitropos of Herod, and that would mean Joanna had to be a person of nobility. Okay, so the ossuary is a person of nobility. She's a granddaughter of the high priest. It turns out, when I did some investigation, the daughters of the high priests did intermarry with the Herods. All right. Now, last thing, if you look at, last night we talked about structure. The structure of the documents are often significant in terms of meaning. In Luke chapter 24, I believe, there is a chiastic structure where it goes sort of A, B, C, D. D is the center, and then it backs out. But that's the sort of structure you see with repeating themes. And there's a structure there in Luke's account of the resurrection. The fascinating thing about the structure is Joanna is the center of it. Joanna is the most central witness to the resurrection. You've got a Mary, you've got the apostles, you've got another Mary, you've got a Joanna, then you've got a Mary, some apostles. It's a fascinating thing. It's like, why is she so important? Well, it sort of fits with the Theophilus ossuary that Pastor Morlock was talking about. If this is written, if Luke is writing to Theophilus the high priest, Joanna is going to be a very significant witness. In fact, she is the most important witness to the resurrection in that account. So it makes sense if Theophilus is the high priest and that's his granddaughter. Sort of, it makes a nice fit. All right, now this morning, what we're going to talk about is something related to our cross and resurrection theme, and that is the meaning and significance of Golgotha itself. Let me open this up this way and do a full screen. And that way we can all see this. All right, so locating Golgotha. This is a fascinating journey as we look through the text. I found that as we start asking questions about Golgotha, you get a lot of significance in the place. Number one, this is not like Aesop's fables where you have the tortoise and the hare, and you don't have any named places in a text like that. It's more about the moral of the story. There are a lot of people who think the Bible, they were raised with the flannelgraph Jesus and the moral of the story. I sat next to a guy who was flying to Camp Pendleton once. He's going to train to become a U.S. Marine. And he happened to be like reading his New Testament, started to close it up. And I said, hey, before you close that, can I show you something interesting? I was kind of looking over, like, what's he reading? And then I showed him a section that basically pointed to the historicity of the text in question, like a little one of these nooks and crannies that actually proved or lent credence to the fact that this is real history. And so he looked at me and he says, you mean to tell me this is real? This really happened? The guy was raised in a home where this was a significant thing to do, is to read. He had it with him and he was reading it, but he didn't think it was real history. And so he had this curious look on his face that this is real, this really happened. And so that's an important thing for us, I think, to recover in our day. This is not just sort of Middle Earth kind of things, not Aesop's fables. This is real history. In fact, the fact that it's real history is part of our creed. It's not just Jesus, is a cool, groovy teacher, and he was sort of resurrected in this mythological sense. He was crucified under Pontius Pilate, an actual, historical person. We have archaeological remains that mention his name. All right, so in terms of locating Golgotha, there's significance to understanding the geography. Number one, that's real history. There's a real there-ness to it. And it also, I think, illumines other texts. When you scratch and you dig into the text, you find new things, and other connections come up, other resonances that help to illuminate the significance of it all. So just starting with some of the basic texts, we're told in John chapter 19, see if that's cutting off. Yes, it's cutting off. Let's make it so it's not. that they took Jesus and he went out to this place called the place of a skull, which in Aramaic is called Golgotha. Notice that there's that going out, this leaving. Where was he? He was in Jerusalem, and then he went out. Acts chapter 7 says something like this with regard to Stephen. They took Stephen and they threw him out of the city and stoned him. The stoning wouldn't take place in the city. It would be something out of the city. Right? Hebrews, again, confirms this too. For the bodies of those animals are burned outside the camp. Jesus also suffered outside the gate. Therefore, let's go to him outside the camp. This outside the camp language is really significant, and it actually takes us back all the way into the Torah, the language of Moses, about those who were taken outside the camp. A couple texts in particular that discuss this. Numbers 15, they brought the lawbreaker outside the camp and stoned him to death. So the language there of outside the camp that the book of Hebrews mentions, and stoning of Stephen, they took him out. John, they took him out. It's all telling the same story. They're following the laws of Moses. Who would have thunk it? And the stoning, the place of death, the place of capital punishment is outside the camp. That was the classical language. So we need to kind of understand what that means. Similarly, Numbers 19 talks about this, the red heifer sacrifice that was also performed outside the camp. And this is something that there's a connection to the place of capital punishment and the place of certain sacrifices. There's a sacrifice in the temple in front of the sanctuary, but there's also this place outside the camp that's referred to in a number of Old Testament texts where certain special sacrifices were done that purified all the temple. It purified the temple, it purified all the utensils in the temple. Okay, so what is this? Where was this place outside the camp? Here's where nerdy people like me who have a lot of questions, we look into the ancient texts of the Jewish sources. So Pastor Morlock was asking, like, what are these different texts? Well, we should talk about that. The Mishnah is the oldest part of the Talmud, and the Mishnah and the Talmud are basically the oral teachings of Israel that then later get written down, but they were memorized. And one of the things that's very easy to see is when you compare things said in the Dead Sea Scrolls that were written down before the time of Jesus. It corresponds very well to the oral teaching that we find in the Mishnah and the Talmud. So it was, the oral culture was very good at what it did. So some people don't like to trust in this because it's written late, but you know, that's partly because you don't trust memory because you live in a non-oral culture, and you want things written down. But actually, scholars have shown that memorized sayings are very, very reliable, and that's, you can demonstrate that by looking at just the comparative work from Jewish sources. The Dead Sea Scrolls range from a date like 250 BC all the way to just around the time of Jesus. Certain texts that were written. So it's a date range. Most of the texts that we have, you want to think of roughly 100, 150 years before the time of Jesus. Also, we have intertestamental documents like pseudepigrapha, a text like Enoch. It's claimed to be written by Enoch, this obscure character in the Old Testament. He actually wrote something, and now we just discovered it. It's a little fanciful, but there are texts like that, and it tells us a lot about Jewish theology. All right, so here are some passages from the Mishnah, the Talmud, the Dead Sea Scrolls related to the place outside the camp. Mishnah says, the place of stoning is well outside the court, as it is said, bring forth him who blasphemed to a place outside the camp. Okay, so it's saying in the Second Temple world, they had a place like that, just like in the days of Moses, in the tabernacle. We have a place outside the camp for stoning. And it cites, Leviticus 24, the passage we looked at. The Talmud also says it is to take place to the east of Jerusalem. Partly, this is self-evident because even if you look at the Old Testament language, the tabernacle faced to the east, and the gate, there's only one gate, and it was to the east. And the tribe around on the eastern side, there's the Levites who were around, they camped around it. Moses and Joshua were at the gate. And then around that were all the 12 tribes, and the tribe of Judah was at the eastern side too. So it was like Moses and Joshua and the Levites here, and then the tribe of Judah here. So something very significant about the eastern side of the gate to the temple, the holy place. And then beyond that, outside that third camp, so there's the camp of God, the camp of the Levites, the camp of Judah, or all the 12 tribes, but on that side is the camp of Judah. And then after that was outside the camp. And you'll sometimes see in the Dead Sea Scrolls a reference to outside 3 camps. And that makes sense when you understand the language from the Torah. We have determined, says the Dead Sea Scrolls, that the sanctuary is the tabernacle, that Jerusalem is the camp, and that outside the camp is outside Jerusalem, where they take the ashes for the altar and burn the sin offering. So there was a place outside the temple, outside Jerusalem, where they had a special altar. And it was to the east, and it was outside the city line of Jerusalem. Talmud, the burning of the bullock is an atonement for the congregation, and stoning likewise is an atonement for the malefactor. In both cases, the leading outside the camp occurs in order to take life, that of the blasphemer and the sacrifice yet to be slaughtered. They actually connected the idea of atonement to both the sacrifice and the capital punishment. Why would they do that, do you think? Why would they have this idea that the capital punishment is a kind of atonement? I think it's actually related to something we find in a couple of Old Testament passages. Maybe, I don't have it on the slide. We'll look at the next slide. Here's an image that I found online of this altar on the Mount of Olives. So this is the Holy of Holies, and this is going across the Kidron Valley into the Mount of Olives, and on here at the top, the red heifer sacrifice. Here's what the Mishnah says. They would make a causeway, arches upon arches, on which the priest who burns the cow would go forth from the temple to the Mount of Olives. This is the arches. I believe it was like an occasional thing. The burning of the red heifer wasn't a regular, it was more like a 50-year thing. So they would construct it for the purpose of wood, not like stone like this. This is also at an angle. We'll see language that this particular sacrifice is looking directly at the temple, not from an angle. So to be technical, this location here would be Mount Scopus, not the Mount of Olives, if you really knew the geography, which they don't. It's kind of like your pastor referred to sarcophaguses instead of sarcophagi. I was following him up until that point. It's like, who does that? Anyway. That's funny. It's like, why is English like this? It's like sarcophagus, sarcophagi. Platypus, platypi? It doesn't make any sense. English is so weird. All right. They would make a causeway upon arches, on which the priest who burns the cow goes forth from the temple to the Mount of Olives. For the priest who burns the red heifer sacrifice stands at the top of the Mount of Olives, looking directly at the door of the sanctuary. With his face turned west, that is toward the temple, he's on the east. The priest slaughters the cow with his right hand, receives the blood with the left, and then he sprinkles 7 times the blood towards the front of the Holy of Holies. I think that's significant. Put it in the back of your mind. The place of stoning. Okay, here is the Talmud on the place of stoning. They put a man to death, not in the court at his own town, but they bring him to the high court in Jerusalem. This is for Judeans. They would sometimes do that in a different district, like in Galilee. You may have read the scene where Jesus offends people in the synagogue. They take him to the cliff.
Yeah.
Again, taking to a cliff and throwing off a cliff is the way they stone people to death, not by throwing rocks. Sometimes they'll pick up rocks. That's a symbolic gesture as they're leading you out of town to throw you off. And if you don't die when you land at the bottom, that's when they throw stones. Make sure they finish you off. Notice this part here too. And they keep him until a festival, and they put him to death at the festival. That matches really, really well with what we have in the Gospels. Both for Jesus, killed on the eve of Passover, and with the two criminals that are with him. They were kept for the festival. Why would they keep someone to the festival, do you think?
More people, there'd be a lot of people there.
That'd be a lot of people.
And,
So
and it would be a deterrent.
it'd be a deterrent, yeah. It's like a lot of people come in, it's like, okay, oh yes, I don't want this to happen to me. I better keep the law and not violate the things that are spoken there. The Mishnah, they establish a place of stoning outside the court so that it will not appear as if the court is committing murder. They say, let my death be an atonement for all my transgressions. Again, there's that atonement language for capital punishment. All those who are stoned are hanged on a tree afterwards. This is the typical way of capital punishment. It's stoning and then hanging. And you take this, you stone the person, he dies and then is hanged on the tree, but only for one day, and then not before sundown. Not all day. So then, this is one of the things that John's gospel in particular highlights. He highlights the fact that the way Jesus was going to be crucified was going to be alive on the tree, which is very, very, it was the Roman way of execution, crucifixion, and it was a dastardly thing. You find references in the Jewish writings. We just saw it with Stephen. He was stoned. James, the brother of Jesus, was stoned. There's an exception here. Why was Jesus crucified? It was a very, it's highlighted in John's gospel as like the way Jesus said this signified the kind of death he was going to die. And so that becomes like, this was a very unexpected thing. Okay, so let my death be an atonement for my transgressions. Well, why is that a thing? Well, let's look at Numbers 35, 33. The blood pollutes the land, and no atonement can be made for the land, but for the blood that is shed in it, except by the blood of the one who shed it. So I think what you find in the Jewish writings is maybe a misinterpretation of this. There is a kind of an atonement that's happening, but it's for the purification of the land. So what you can think of it is, this is a holy priesthood, the kingdom, it's a holy nation, a kingdom of priests. And the land is sanctified by Yahweh's presence. And when the people sin, they defile the land. But murder is a high thing that it's like, if you touched a dead body, you'd be unclean. If a murder is committed in the land becomes unclean, and capital punishment is the only way to make it ritually pure again. So some of the Jews began to connect that to you could commit certain sins, and you could have, especially the unintentional sins in the Mosaic economy, and you could have atonement. But if it was a high-handed sin of certain kinds, most of the Ten Commandments actually, you could not have an animal slain for you, and that would be okay again. You had to be slain. Didn't mean you wouldn't be resurrected doesn't Jesus say this? Like, tomorrow you'll be with me in paradise. The person, the thief on the cross, wasn't necessarily damned, but he did have capital punishment. In the same way, like here's a good story. Think about King David. King David committed murder. He admits this too. He admits the horrible nature in Psalm 51 of his crimes. And this is something, he is a high-handed sin, right? It wasn't an unintentional thing. He actually gets special clemency mentioned by Nathan, the prophet. This will not be held against you. Although there will be a curse, there will be ramifications in his family, but he won't have to die. That required a special clemency from God's anointed prophet for him not to have capital punishment. Most of the time, if you commit murder, you have to bear the consequences. Okay, so it becomes a sacred thing, like the red heifer sacrifice at the sacred spot outside the camp. This is where people had to be put to death, and it was kind of viewed as cleansing the land. There's a New Testament scholar by the name of Philip Comfort who says, strictly speaking, the pronoun them in the first part of John 19:16, which says, he delivered him to them, he being Pilate, he delivered him, Jesus, to them, the them there in that sentence, refers to the chief priests. He delivered Jesus to the chief priests. John wanted his readers to know that it was the Jewish leaders who were ultimately responsible for Jesus' death, even though the Romans performed the execution. It's the chief priests who take Jesus to his location. Now, because it's crucifixion, that's an unclean thing that they're not used to. They wouldn't actually do the stoning, in this case, transferring it to crucifixion. They wouldn't do that. So they are, and also the high priests are not just, we kind of think in terms of our view. Priests are religious people and Pilate is the governing. The priests are also governors. They're the high officials in the land and they have a lot of governing capacity, especially because it's a theocracy. So they are Pilate. They had to go to Pilate to request capital punishment because it had been taken from them under a guy named Coponius, maybe a couple of rulers before Pontius Pilate. Josephus says so. Capital punishment had been taken away. That's why they go. And they tell Pilate. In fact, Pilate at one says, if you want to crucify him, you do it. And they say, the Jews say, it is unlawful for us to do this. It's not unlawful from the Ten Commandments, or from the laws of Moses. Capital punishment was lawful under Moses' law, but not under the recent Roman law. They knew it better than Pilate did in that scene. And then, so finally, but they're also calling not just for death, but for crucifixion. And this is the cry, not of the people, but of the people there at that early morning mock trial, that all the priests and their friends were calling for the crucifixion, because it was a dark thing that had happened, that they were trying to get rid of this guy, this troublemaker. Now, let's think about the meaning of this word, Golgotha. The meaning of the word Golgotha. So in Hebrew, there is a word, Golgolet, this anglicized version here, and Aramaic, Golgotha, and in Greek, Kranion. Okay? When you look at the way this is, here's a great verse that really helps us to understand this. This is Numbers chapter 1, verse 2. We see in Numbers 1, verse 2, take every census of every male head by head. The Hebrew word for census there is Rosh. You heard of Rosh Hashanah? It's head of the year. Okay, it's just the Hebrew word for head. So census. Why would head be census? Well, it's like a head count. Take a head count, and that becomes the word census. Of every male head by head. Well, here, where these particular instances are, it's the Hebrew word Golgolet. And when this is translated into Aramaic, that's the word Golgotha. It's slightly different from the Hebrew, but very close. Golgotha is what I believe is where we get our name, Golgotha. Okay? And the question is, does it mean skull or does it mean head? Well, it actually can mean both. And we can see this by the way it's translated in a lot of different places where you find the word translated. Sometimes you see it does mean skull, but mostly it refers to head. Here's an example when you see this word translated into Syriac. The word cranion is translated into karkopto, and that is definitely more the head than the skull. They have a different word for skull. One translation uses this word. It's another Greek version that refers to encephalo. You've heard of encephalitis. That's the swelling of the head, and so this would be an alternative to cranion that refers more to head than skull. And then there's the Calvaria, which we get Calvary. We get it from the Latin Calvary. So when this was translated from the Latin Vulgate, Golgotha became Calvaria. And Calvaria means the top of the head. That doesn't mean skull. So here's just a couple definitions. The Greek lexicon LSJ says, cranion equals the upper part of the head, skull, Brill. Cranium, skull, head, Leonida. The bony framework of the head, especially the upper portion, or skull. So it can mean these different things. It can mean skull, and it can mean head. And what I'm suggesting is, All the English translations typically go with the skull, but there's another possibility here that it could also mean head. And what would happen if we translated it that way? All right, Josephus, when he is using this word cranion in one part, he describes the solid part of the head, and he's using that same word cranion. There's a fascinating scene in 2 Samuel where David goes up the ascent of the Mount of Olives and comes to the summit where God was worshipped. And there he uses the word Rosh. He comes to the summit, the head of the Mount of Olives. And the fascinating thing is when that's translated into Greek, that word Rosh is not translated from Hebrew to Greek. It's transliterated, and it's spelled with Greek characters, which you can see here if I'll scroll this up here. This is the Raos in Greek. Now, why would they translate? What's a good explanation for why they wouldn't put like a different word there, but they would transliterate in Greek, spelling out basically Rosh?
It was a known place name?
It was a place name. It's a very good theory. That's my theory. So, in other words, even in Greek, they called it the Rosh. The top of the Mount of Olives is called the head, the summit place. There's a document here called the Testament of Solomon that James Charlesworth, a Princeton scholar, very, very well recognized. He does a lot of stuff in the intertestamental period, all the documents, the pseudepigrapha. There is general agreement that much of the Testament of Solomon reflects first century Judaism in Palestine. And in chapter 12 of this document, a demonic being says, I am thwarted by the site which is called the place of the head. This is the document I was referring to that talked about the tapu encephalu, the place of the head, not skull. And I think it's reflecting Christian view of Golgotha. That's what thwarts the enemy, the place where Jesus died. I believe that's what's happening in this text. And the next chapter then goes on to tell of one who is hung up in front of the temple in order that all those sons of Israel may pass through and see. So here, now we do know that the eastern part of the temple and its gates, there are not gates on the back side or on the sides. The gates, there are gates, but they're not the court gates. The temple courts meet in the gates, so the judicial proceedings, they look out this way toward the Mount of Olives. We have language to this effect. There's actually language about the court sending up the victim, the one who will be executed, and they will raise flags in case they have a changing of the opinion. Like, new evidence just came in, and so they raise the flag, and then the people far away before the execution see the flag, and they say, okay, we're canceling the execution. That's in the Talmud. The only thing is, there's only one place in Jerusalem where that could be seen. The court would be on the eastern gate, and the only place that could be seen would be the Mount of Olives. So there's so many different points of evidence that take you to the execution site being on the Mount of Olives. In this case, we have a text referring to first century beliefs and practices that show a person was taken to the place of the head and was hung up in front of the temple. So that everybody who could see would pass through and see. It's also in a big area where there's a lot of people passing through. The Mishnah, we've looked at this already. The priest who burns the red heifer stands at the top of the Mount of Olives. This is where the red heifer sacrifice was located. It's not just on the Mount of Olives, but it's at the top. Now the top is the Rosh. What I'm suggesting is that the Rosh is the Hebrew name that later becomes, when the people come back from Babylon and they're speaking Aramaic, they call the top of the Mount of Olives Golgotha. That's Maranatha, an Aramaic word, Maranatha. The th endings are very Aramaic. So anytime you see a th ending, it's probably an Aramaic version of something. And Golgotha is the Aramaic name for the top of the Mount of Olives. So instead of it being the place of the skull, like a picture of death, it could be a location name. So let's just play with that hypothesis as we explore what this could possibly mean. Look here at this picture of the city of Jerusalem and the Mount of Olives. Notice here the temple and the Holy of Holies and the summit. Notice how it's in a straight line? And that's the language we find in the second temple literature, that this was the priest stood directly in front of the temple as he sprinkled the blood towards the front of the Holy of Holies. So Rosh equals Golgotha. It's the summit. Summit is probably the best definition because it's the word head, but when you apply the word head to the peak of the mountain, then it becomes summit. That's certainly the way it's being used in the 2 Samuel passage we looked at. David came to the summit. He came to the head of the Mount of Olives. Odes of Solomon. Okay, so the Odes of Solomon are a collection of hymns that James Charlesworth has actually written a book called The Earliest Christian Hymn Book. And these, he argues, are a collection of hymns by Jewish Christians in the 1st century. The cool thing about this collection of hymns that most people aren't aware of, it was only found 100 years ago, and they have tons of allusions to the Gospel of John. I actually think Charlesworth is right. I think when you look at the language, it does appear to be 1st century. Some of it seems to be like the Jewish war, is still in the future. So it's pre-70 in some cases. He argues that it's a hymn collection, so you would have to date each individual hymn. You know, they weren't necessarily all written at the same time, but it definitely looks pre-Christian. It's Jewish Christian, Palestinian, 1st century. Some could bleed into the 2nd century. But fascinating, though, is that when you look at Ode 33, there's a reference to the fact that Jesus stood on the peak of a summit and cried out aloud from one end of the earth to the other, and he drew to him those who obeyed him, for he did not appear. Then he drew all to him, all those who obeyed him, for he did not appear as the evil one. When you look at that particular passage, there are like 3 distinct allusions to a John text, John chapter 12, where Jesus says, the ruler of this world will be cast out. So there's the Satan reference. They will be cast out when I am lifted up on the cross, and then I draw all men to myself. You have all these 3 distinct things. He's there. There's a reference to the drawing, and there's a reference to the evil one, and there's a reference to the crucifixion at the peak of a summit where he cries. So that peak of a summit could be the place he was executed. And it's another reference, early 1st century reference to the fact that it was a high place. By the way, this is like a very common theme in the Old Testament. Get rid of all the high places. Get rid of, we don't worship in all these different high places. Only in the one place, one authorized place, here on the Mount of Moriah, where the temple is built. But the Temple Mount faces the Mount of Olives, which is a little bit taller. And the Mount of Olives is very significant in redemptive history for a lot of reasons. Again, it's associated with resurrection. The Jews put a lot of burial there. They believe this would be the place of resurrection. When you actually read through their text, they believe this is where resurrection will happen. Partly because of the Zechariah prophecy, is the Mount of Olives is split. They believe what happens at the last day, and the resurrection happens there. The Lord leaves the temple at one point, and his feet stand at the Mount of Olives. But think about, too, just the language itself. The Mount of Olives, olives were used for anointing oil, so some of the rabbinic writings refer to as the Mount of Anointing, because of the anointing oil that was there. Jesus actually was anointed there by Mary at Bethany with olive oil, or with the very expensive perfume. And then you have so Gethsemane was there in the Mount of Olives, the olive press. I just think Jesus was frequently camping out. He frequently went to the Mount of Olives. A lot of historical references there. Cyril of Jerusalem, who lives in the 4th century, says he's a guy who gives us a little bit of insight into how we maybe should interpret this word head. Who were those then who prophetically named the spot Golgotha, in which Christ, the true head, endured the cross. As the apostle says, he is the head of the body of the church. This holy Golgotha, which stands high above us, shows itself to this day. Notice he's making the connection to head, not skull, because it can mean both. And he keeps referring to the head after talking about Golgotha. And then he talks about the fact that he's giving this lecture in Jerusalem, and he's kind of pointing to it. This stands high above us. It's not just a small crucifixion mound. It's high above us, wherever he happens to be pointing. John gives us some very interesting detailed description in chapter 19. He says, so Pilate handed him, Jesus, over to them, the high priest, to be crucified. So they took Jesus, and he went out bearing his own cross to that which is called, my translation, Summit Place. To that which is called Summit Place. That's probably the way I would translate it. The SRV. Shane Rosenthal version. Which is in Aramaic called Golgotha. Pilate also wrote an inscription and put it on the cross. And many read this inscription, for the place where Jesus was crucified was near to the city. Notice it says near to the city. The few references we have in the New Testament, when you say near, it doesn't mean just outside the gate. It's usually a reference to sections of places on the Mount of Olives. Like they were near to the city, a Sabbath journey away, a certain number of stadia, certain that you were allowed to walk on the Sabbath. 3 or 4 references that it was near, that he didn't speak, he was near the city. Just right there on the Mount of Olives is where he was always. So this seems to fit with that. Verses 44, oops, I went too far. Verses 41 through 42. Now in the place where he was crucified, there was a garden, and in the garden a new tomb. So this is a very interesting thing. In the place, there was a garden. Okay, so if you have Golgotha being a crucifixion mound, that doesn't really work. In that there's a garden, unless you take the inn as nearby, which you can. It's not impossible. But that garden language, the kapos, is an interesting word that I think can shed light on this as well. The Greek version of 2 Kings 5:26 uses the word kapos to describe a vineyard or an orchard, vineyards and olive orchards, which seem to fit well with the Mount of Olives location. So if you think about kapos as an orchard, that gives you this idea of a bigger place. Within Golgotha it's an expansive area that includes an orchard. An olive orchard in particular is a very good connection for the Mount of Olives, for obvious reasons. Same with John's reference to the Garden of Gethsemane, John 18:1. The Garden of Gethsemane, the kapos of Gethsemane, we do know that it's an olive orchard. It's an olive orchard because the word Gethsemane means olive press. They're taking the olives and they are pressing them here to make the olive oil. Interesting too, that's the place where Jesus was so stressed out and depressed as he was heading to Golgotha. Finally, Golgotha does not appear to be an execution mound, but a much larger district perhaps that includes a garden, orchard, plantation of some kind. Those are all possible definitions for kapos, within which a new expensive tomb was situated. That last part here, that there was a new tomb in this place that's in Golgotha, it seems to me to fit much better with the idea of Golgotha being at the top of the Mount of Olives. If you are one of the wealthy members of the Sanhedrin, would you put your family tomb outside the city wall near the crucifixion mound? The unclean place of death? If you go to Jerusalem and you actually go to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, you'll see the place of crucifixion is only like 20 or 30 feet away from the burial tomb. Okay, so this is, if you look at this, this is one of the graphics from the ESV. You zoom in here. So this is their replication of the hill of Golgotha, which looks, it's a burial mound. It's the head or skull, either way. There's another place that looks like a skull. We'll talk about that too. This here would be the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea in their view, and this would be their garden. So it's near a garden, maybe something that was garden set certainly isn't just wilderness area. It's definitely manicured, and this area here would be very close, and it would be. It's not the desirable place for people to be buried on that side. The very expensive, wealthy people put their tombs on the Mount of Olives. And would they do it so close to the unclean place of death and punishment that the Romans were using? Also, notice here, this is the back side of the Holy of Holies. The front side would be facing the Mount of Olives that way. So this is a strange location if you're going to have someone witnessing the temple curtain tearing. Mark's gospel makes this pretty clear. When the temple curtain tears, the centurion sees that and responds to it. It's the only thing. Matthew's gospel also mentions an earthquake, but Mark's gospel highlights the temple curtain being the thing that the centurion sees and responds to. Look at this language. Jesus uttered a loud cry, standing on the peak of the summit in front, and breathed his last. And the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. Notice that language of top to bottom because it's a very long temple curtain, and that's significant. When the centurion who faced him, Jesus, saw that in this way he breathed his last, he said, "Truly this man was the Son of God." So he breathes, so he sees something significant. As he is expiring, the temple curtain tears. Given that he died in this way, he says he's the Son of God. This seems to me to be significant. Like he is responding to some kind of external thing, and the only thing mentioned by Mark is the temple curtain tearing, which means he has to be in a location where he could see the temple curtain. Now, most of us are confused about the temple curtain because we think it's referring to the curtain dividing the inner part of the temple from the Holy of Holies. There is a curtain there. But if you look at Josephus' writings, he says there are two curtains. And this one here, he says, the sanctuary had golden doors, 55 cubits high, and 16 broad. Before these doors hung a veil of equal length, a Babylonian tapestry with embroidered of blue and fine linen, of scarlet and purple, wrought with marvelous skill. The innermost part was also separated from the outer part by a veil and was called the Holy of Holies. So there's two curtains. And the big curtain that would be visible would be hanging in front of the big entrance there to the Holy of Holies. So this had a Babylonian tapestry, and it would be very, very tall from top to bottom. I actually read one of the early, I think it's called the Syriac Peshitta. It's a translation of the Greek New Testament into Syriac, which is very close to Aramaic. And it mentions that during the earthquake, one of the lintels of the door broke off, and as it did, it carried the curtain with it. So when it talks about the curtain tearing, it mentions the lintel tearing and the temple curtain tore. So if you're thinking like, how could the temple curtain tear? That particular translation, which is early, probably sometime in the early 2nd century, it seems to indicate that it tore because part of the stone of that temple facade ended up bringing it down. Outside the temple itself, the Mount of Olives is the only location in the region where a person would be able to see the temple curtain tearing from top to bottom. So this is another one of these images from the vantage point of the Mount of Olives, and though not looking directly, but it is, everywhere else in Jerusalem. If you go to Jerusalem today, you would go to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which is somewhere around here. The other place, sort of north, where you have a cliff that looks like a skull. Nobody ever said anything about that looking like a skull until the 1800s when it was discovered. So the question is, did that particular area look like a skull before that? Is it something that later appeared? But the problem with that is that that's north, and you wouldn't have been able to see anything going on with the curtain. It's kind of behind and to the north. The only place to see the temple curtain tearing would have been at the top of the Mount of Olives. And there's so much other evidence that connects us to the top of the Mount of Olives. By the way, if you look at the Talmud, the Mishnah actually, there's a line here. It says, one should not act silly. One should not act silly while facing the eastern gate of the temple, or it faces toward the chamber of the Holy of Holies. This is a sacred spot. Remember, like, think about if you're a member of the Sanhedrin, where do you want to be buried? You want to be buried at the sacred spot, located, associated with resurrection, and facing the Holy of Holies. It's associated with sacredness. There's a special altar there. All these associations, that's the more desirable location. It's the only place you can see the temple curtain tearing. It's probably the best explanation for what Golgotha actually means. So this is an artist's rendering of what happens at the crucifixion. Someone commissioned this artist, Archaeology Illustrated. He has a lot of great work. And he commissioned him to do a crucifixion scene facing the Holy of Holies. And this would be like depicting, it's on a walkway where there's a lot of traffic, people coming into Jerusalem from this area. It would be a bigger district. So you want to think of the top of the Mount of Olives with olive groves, and that would be somewhere in that Joseph of Arimathea's property. That's my view. I think this is a pretty fair representation of what may have happened. It's interesting too that the bone fragment that we found with one person who was crucified, it had olive wood, because some people argue that it wasn't like wooden crosses as much as it was actually on olive trees. You would take the beam, they would carry their beam, and then they would nail the beam to the tree so you could have proportional length, but then they would nail your feet to the trunk of the tree. That's also a possibility, but the fact that it's an olive tree is really interesting. Olive trees were common on the Mount of Olives. All right, so that's, now think about the resonances with the rest of the Bible. At the very beginning of the Bible, we're told that God drove the man out. Which direction? He drove him out, east of Eden. Did you know that all the imagery inside the temple is Edenic? It's palm trees and all the imagery, the sacred imagery is sort of like the closer you get in, it's like successive zones of holiness, and the further you get in, you get to God's presence, and you find that same kind of language there in Genesis. Anyway, it's a long story, but the point is, it's a good book on this would be G.K. Beale's The Temple and the History of Israel, something to that effect. The very easy, accessible version of that he wrote with Mitch Kim called God Dwells Among Us. God Dwells Among Us tells the story of how the temple and it is a retelling of the Eden story. The whole history of redemption is how do we get back to God's presence? And the answer of Golgotha is we don't have to be exiled because he was exiled for us. He was sent out. He was sent away from God's presence. He bore God's wrath in the face of God. They talk about this, like make a sacrifice before the Lord. It's often before the sanctuary, before his place of his presence. And this is what Jesus is doing for us. He is exiled for us to the place of punishment. But remember, murder defiles the land. And this is sort of the opposite. So the innocent victim, in fact, if you look at some of the writings of the Jewish priests, they would go and they would place their hand on the sacrificial victim, and they would also do that on the murderer who is about to be executed. They would place their hands and they would ask him to confess his sins. In this case, this is it's, again, not the way we think of capital punishment. For them, it's a sacred right. It's a sacred right that in this case, because he's an innocent victim, he's an innocent, eternally begotten, the Lord of all creation, this particular victim, when he is sacrificed, his blood speaks a nobler word than the blood of Abel. Mm-hmm. It's very rich in all the themes that it ties together. He was executed he bore the death curse in the place where victims were put to death. He bore that for us. All right, questions, comments?
I have a ton, I'm wondering if we should wait till the second one?
So we're running, we want to just move the next lecture?
Take a quick break and then do the
Okay,
next
all
one?
right, we'll
Is
take a
that all
quick
right?
break. Sure, sure.